238, chapters 17 and 18 of Dracula. Welcome to CraftLit, the podcast for crafters who love books. My name is Heather Ordover, and I'm podcasting from the shores of the Potomac in Virginia, the Old Dominion. Episode 238, HNY, etc. This episode of CraftLit is brought to you by Knit Circus, the online magazine featuring 3 rings of knitting, sewing, and fun. You can find out more by visiting www.knitcircus.com. Also, Cool for Cats, the new novel by Andrew C. Ordover. You can get it at amazon.com. Or find out more from the link in the show notes. Also, don't forget, you can now access CraftLit via Stitcher Radio, the free application. You can download Stitcher onto your iPhone, iPod, iPad, BlackBerry, Crackberry, Droid, and probably some other forms of communicationality. I am not entirely sure. They seem to be everywhere. But on Stitcher, you can listen to the most recent podcasts. I have Stitcher now on my phone, and I have learned in listening to some of my other favorite podcasts that there are some limitations. It doesn't do the entire backlog. It doesn't do, like, you can't at this point go back and listen to the very beginning of Dracula on Stitcher. You can hear the most recent, I think, 6 episodes, which doesn't take you far back enough. However, if you are caught up as of this point, then Stitcher Radio is an excellent place for you to jump into the fray, as it were, and find yourself able to listen to CraftLit on the go, streaming anywhere you can get a signal. And so far, I have found that the interface is quite easy to use once I took the time to set it up and follow their little tutorial. And I've been enjoying using that. Now, the difference between the paid app and the Stitcher app is the paid app, which is still available for iPod, iPhone, iTouch, iPhone, and Droid. The main difference there is that you get the entire catalog at your fingertips. If you're in a Wi-Fi environment, it's certainly difficult to do that from a 3G. And you also have the extras. And next week there will be another knitting pattern that goes out with it. Over the Christmas holidays, a goofy Christmas wallpaper went out. Little things like that I can't put into Stitcher or anything like that. Now, with Stitcher Radio, when you first sign up, we'll ask you where you learned about Stitcher Radio at the top of the sign-in screen. Please tap on that link and tell them that CraftLit sent you. Also, you can visit audiblepodcast.com/CraftLit and start your free trial for 2 weeks at the Audible site. Now, we're going to actually have a lot of information on audiobook sites shortly that was brought to my attention by our listener and reader, Arielle Lipshaw. So I have that for you in a moment, but Audible is always a very, very good site. For those of us who find our hands busy all the time, I was not able to listen to as many books as I wanted to. I did finally finish Hemingway's Movable Feast, though, and a more heartbreaking narrative I have not read. However, make sure if you listen to Hemingway's Movable Feast, which is basically his Paris Diaries revised slightly, make sure you listen to the longer version that was fixed up by his son and grandson. Now that I've listened to the whole thing, I can tell you that it is quite clear that his boys went back and put back a number of comments that were not in the version that I read back in 97, I think. Whatever book was available back then, there were a number of statements that he makes about Hadley, about his first wife, his Paris wife, that did not appear in the version that I'd read, or at least that I don't remember appearing in the version that I read, and I think it would have kind of stuck with me. And again, if you read or listen to Paris Wife at the same time that you're reading or listening to the Hemingway Movable Feast. It is quite enlightening. And while I never really liked Hemingway fiction, I am realizing that that's because as a 14-year-old I was being asked to read The Old Man and the Sea, which is a book about an old man. And what does that have to do with you when you're 14? Nothing. Not a bloody thing. Instead, you know, if they'd wanted us to read Hemingway, they should have had us read short stories, because even something like The Sun Also Rises or For Whom the Bell Tolls, really inappropriate for freshmen in high school. I don't know what my professor was thinking. Anyway, doesn't matter. Water under the bridge. Much better time now to listen to some really good books. Well, Happy New Year, HNY, as it were. Happy New Year and all that jazz, and I hope you are having a happy one. This winter season so far has not been fraught with snowmageddon, it seems, for anyone, although there has been snow for some of you. Not at the level that we saw last year. My boys are traumatized by this fact. All they wanted was snow. If we have to move to Virginia, at least we should get some snow. And I am unable to provide that for them, so there it is. But we are back from our travels in Arizona, travels that took me off of the interwebs. I could barely get email the whole time I was gone. It was really quite nerve-wracking. I'm not used to that at all, what with living on the internet and everything. But it was a nice holiday. I hope yours was as well. And join me today, this would be Friday, January 6th, in wishing Shannon Oakey, our publisher at Cooperative Press, publisher of What Would Madame Defarge Knit, wishing Shannon a happy birthday in the Twitter sphere and all of that. Drop by and tell her CraftLit sent you, and it will just make her day. And if you don't hear this until later, drop by and tell her whenever you hear. Now, I promised you some very specific audio at the beginning of the podcast. Some of that audio comes in the form of a conversation between me and Arielle Lipshaw, who you know as both dramaturg extraordinaire and Lucy Westenra of our current story, Dracula. But before I read that to you, I want to let you know something extraordinary that I received as a blog update in my inbox. Now, some of you have been following, I know, Remily Knits. This is the blog Remily R. Emily. Remily Knits, all one word. Her blog is very interesting because I have never seen such a prolific knitter in my life. The woman who is also a listener, so hi. I didn't mean to make you do a spit take while you were listening to the podcast. Wow, she's talking about me. But my reason for bringing this up is because on January 4th at 10:22 a.m. and 28 seconds, I received an email. And Remily had posted, and I will link to her blog post, an interesting post. She has determined that January for her will be Finish It or Frog It month. And she has a nice picture of all of her semi-finished, not entirely finished, kind of working on it stuff. And she's decided that she will finish the bloody things or she will frog them into submission. And she did. And it's interesting because I see one thing that she was working on that is in her out crowd. And I actually am working on the same pattern. And I am about as far as she is. And she is just saying no. Yes. But I think she says the fussy knitting is losing its charm. And I'm thinking I'm in the same boat. So it's very, very interesting to see someone who is being so decisive in their knitting. I am not usually this decisive. And so it is really, really, really very gratifying is the word I'm looking for, to be able to kind of live vicariously through her and feel like, yes, I can do it. I can say no to some unfinished objects. And in fact, this weekend, I plan to go down to the basement and go through the box that I did drag with me from Arizona. The stash is almost entirely gone, but the box of unfinished objects is not. And I'm going to go through and, gosh darn it, I am going to take the bull by the horns, or take the yarn by the needles and rip those needles out and use a ball winder and get rid of a lot of unfinished objects that way. You know, they've been hibernating on Ravelry for a long time, and it's time. Now, it is finally cold enough, though, in my life for me to work on the Vogue 2002 Map of the World Afghan. And I am going to be at Vogue Knitting live on, January 14th and 15th. I'll be there with Shannon at the Bijou Basin booth. So if you go to the shop, to the marketplace, go to Bijou Basin, I will be there. I will have an official book signing at 4:30 on Saturday. However, I will be about and around and about more than that. So if you are in New York, and if you are going to Vogue Knitting, or if you can just go to the marketplace, please stop by. I will have Defarge books. I will have the Defarge bracelets that Shannon has been holding on to. And if you buy a book, you get a bracelet. And if you buy a book as a gift for somebody, I'll give you 2 bracelets so you can have one too. How's that? Just, you have to make sure that we know that that's what we're doing. But very exciting stuff. So maybe what I really should do is embarrass myself and take my Vogue Map of the World Afghan with me to work on while I'm at Vogue Knitting Live. How's that? Maybe someday I could teach a class for Vogue Knitting Live on how to finish the Map of the World Afghan. Number 1, don't live in a hot climate. Number 2, embarrass yourself publicly on an international podcast. Number 3, see how simple that would be? I like that. All right, well, enough of that fun, silly, giggly stuff. Now it's time to get serious and talk about Dracula. Yes, we're back to Dracula. And today I'm providing you with chapters 17 and 18. And not just because I am a kind, generous, warm-hearted person, but because these 2 chapters really go very nicely together. Nothing major, and I'm putting that in air quotes, happens in today's chapters. I mean, we just left off from the horrific end of Lucy's actual entire life. And they know now how far up the yogurt river they are and how deeply in it they are with no paddle. And they are not really either happy about it or completely entirely dealing with it in the forefront of their brain. And so we have this moment where, once again, all of the chess pieces have to reshuffle on the board. This is, when you're playing chess, there are the moments when you are very clearly advancing an attack, and then there are those moments where you are very clearly arranging your pieces to create the opportunity for the next attack. Not unlike working a Rubik's Cube. Oh my gosh, my sister showed me a video on YouTube. There's this rapper who I'm sure you all know of. I come to the party so late. There is this rapper out there who will rap about anything. You email him and tell him you want him to rap about, friction, and he will rap about it. Somebody wrote in and said, you always have a Rubik's Cube in the back of your raps. Why don't you rap about how to solve a Rubik's Cube? So he does. And he gives you the actual, I'm not joking, instructions in the form of a rap. And he's funny. And he I'm in love. Don't tell my husband, I am in love with this guy. He's hot and he's funny and he's smart and he can rap about how to fix a Rubik's Cube. It's right up there with the end of the 2nd episode ever of Community, which Juliet Forgotten Classics convinced me to start watching, and which now just makes me giggle on a very frequent basis. They did a very silly Spanish rap where very little of it made any sense beyond "Donde está la biblioteca?" It was Spanish 101 rap. And these guys just kind of made it up on the fly. But I'm going to obviously have to put these in the show notes. They're very silly and they're very funny, but the Rubik's Cube setup is, in fact, exactly what's happening in these two chapters. So I thought I'd just put them together and let you get that setup, because then next time we'll be able to move along with more action. But in the process of prepping for this week's episode, I got some very interesting emails. The first actually was from Julie, where, not being Catholic, when I read the section and listened to the section of Van Helsing taking the host, the wafer, and crumbling it and putting it around the door to Lucy's tomb, my reaction was, oh, well, of course. I mean, if you're going to use a cross, if you're going to use holy water, if you're going to use a crucifix or holy water and things like that, then it kind of, my reaction is, well, duh, at some point you're going to have to use a wafer. I would have thought that they would have, put it in her mouth or something when they were killing her, but whatever. There's a fairly iconic moment in the Coppola version of the film where a wafer is used later in the story. But for this, my reaction was, well, sure, okay, I buy it. For Julie, it was really quite disturbing and kind of like, blech, listening to that part of the book. If you think about what the host represents, Jesus's body being crushed and used as a barrier against evil, it is kind of creepy, right? And I think it's important for us not to get too far away from the fact that Bram Stoker was Irish and would have been around Catholicism quite a lot. And that even though people in the C of E and the Anglican Church, the Church of England, it might not strike them as quite so yicky to someone who's actually involved in that faith. It's not a small thing for Van Helsing to have used his indulgence to get himself some of these goodies to use in the fighting of a vampire. Now, the other email I received that led me to the audio that you'll hear in just a moment comes from our listener, Misty. Now, Misty and I have written before, and she always writes really interesting things. And she had a comment that she prevented herself from posting back in 233. And she kept herself from posting it on the show notes because there were some spoilers in her emails. But the stuff that doesn't have a spoiler, I did want to read to you. And this is one of those wonderful moments where I really love CraftLit listeners, because it, as complicated as it is to have a conversation with a podcast when I can't hear you and you can't hear each other when you're talking at home to your headset and me, we do manage to have something of a conversation. And you know that for every person that writes in, there are 100 or 1,000 other people who feel the same way. And so that's one of the reasons why I feel very strongly about reading comments from people who may disagree with me or see things differently from me, because I know that means that there's more of you feeling that way, and it's important to give you a voice. So one of the things that Misty said was that she, while she agrees with Julie from Forgotten Classics, our friend, that there's definitely a Christ/Antichrist aspect going on with the blood transfusions. Both Christ and Dracula give you an afterlife, but where Christ saves your soul, Dracula takes your soul. I think it's a disservice to ignore the sexual side of the transfusions. It was deemed appropriate that Lucy's first donor would be her lover. When a second transfusion was necessary, Van Helsing warned Seward not to mention it to Arthur because, he'd become jealous. Now, she also added a comment here that as for Dracula not being scrupulous about who he sips from, she thinks it misses some key facts too. Now, as of this point in the book, we know about the 3 women in Dracula's castle, and we know about Lucy. So far as we know, Dracula hasn't turned a man. He's used them. He's eaten, he's fed on them, whether it's Jonathan or the men on the ship, but he hasn't turned, that we know of, anyone male. So there is a real female attraction something happening here with Dracula, and it isn't our imagination. And she said, really, what could be a better morality tale for women at the time? The danger is much greater at night. You have to invite the guy in. Your fate is worse than death. And no matter how pure your heart and intentions, like Lucy, you will succumb. And I think that that's just a really wonderful way to put it in the framework of the morality tale. Why are vampires so dangerous? They're seductive, and once you let them in, then the ball starts rolling down the hill at a faster and faster rate. Now, the other thing she said here, and this is what prompted the audio that you're going to hear in just a second. She said she's previously read the story, and she tried to listen to it, but she had a difficult time listening to it because of the quality of some of the readers before. However, she says, I've had a much stronger emotional reaction to the tale this time, especially the person, Arielle Lipshaw, who read Lucy, who brought such a simple goodness and realness to her character that had been previously missing for me. My heart ached for the tragedy of her fate, whereas before the process of her dying, or undying, had seemed overwrought and drawn out to me. And I thought, boy, what more compliment could you ever expect for as a performer in a book like Dracula? And so I forwarded this email to Arielle Lipshaw. And you may remember Arielle and Aaron Ziegler and I spoke together about this time last year, and Aaron Ziegler posted the audio to that. If you haven't listened, it's an interesting discussion about Shakespeare. I think it's an interesting discussion about Shakespeare. And it was an interesting conversation with Arielle, who is a dramaturg in her daily life. However, this is what I learned from Arielle today. So here we are talking with Arielle Lipshaw, fabulous dramaturg, and Lucy from Dracula, and now audiobook reporter, professional audiobook reporter?
Professional audiobook recorder.
How cool is that?
Yeah, it is cool. It is cool. It's something I've been doing for a long time, and I am excited now to do it and actually get paid for it.
Well, yeah, especially as a dramaturg, right?
Yeah.
That's how you're going to make the big bucks.
Yeah, right. Because the dramaturgs make the big bucks. That's why you become a dramaturg.
Absolutely. Did you start with LibriVox?
I started with LibriVox. Coming up on my 3-year anniversary with LibriVox.
Wow.
So I did it for LibriVox for a long time. I did a lot of solos, but actually I did a lot of the dramatic readings of plays and stuff like that on LibriVox and coordinated those. And at a certain point, the guy who founded LibriVox, a guy named Hugh McGuire, sort of started a spin-off site called Iambic, which is actually, a for-pay audio site. So our audiobook production site. So a lot of people from LibriVox are now narrators over there. So yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say to anybody who is interested in getting into audiobook recording is start with LibriVox or something like that, because it's the kind of thing where you have to have experience and a sort of a portfolio of work in order to move on to the stuff that actually pays you money. So I kind of started with LibriVox, which is doing it for free, and then did a couple of books that are like royalty share type of books, just to kind of get experience. And now I'm actually doing books. I'm just starting a book that's actually like a pay per finished hour kind of a thing, which is cool because there's actually basically a guaranteed amount of money that you get at the end, which is quite exciting.
That's huge.
Yeah.
So when you do your recording for Iambic, mm-hmm. do you have to send them finished audio? And does it have to be recorded at a certain level and with certain equipment? Or do they just expect it to sound as good as your stuff always sounds?
and edited and all that, or are they handling the editing side of things?
No. They expect you to send in finished processed files, and their standard is higher than the standard for LibriVox. Because they welcome everybody. Basically, the standard is basically if it's understandable, it's fine. Right. Iambic does call for a higher sound quality. So, no background noise, a clear sound. So I had to learn, because I hadn't been doing this for LibriVox, but I had to learn how to process files a little bit more and be a little bit more diligent as far as editing goes, and getting the timing of pauses right, and taking out like any little clicks and breath sounds and stuff like that you hear. And I didn't really have to upgrade my recording equipment. The microphone I use is a Blue Snowball, which is a pretty affordable microphone. I think it cost me $100 at the Apple Store, which is not an insignificant amount of money, but I get a lot of use out of it. So it was a good investment. I don't have a $5,000 setup in a soundproof booth somewhere, although that would be nice. But I literally record with my little Blue Snowball microphone and my laptop in my bedroom closet, which is great because it's small and full of clothes that dampen the sound, so you don't get echo. Like you do in a lot of people don't realize that if you're just recording in a room at your desk. I didn't realize this for a long time until somebody told me. The room sound that you get is very echoey, particularly if there's a lot of wood in the room for the sound to bounce off of. So it's not so much investing in equipment as really optimizing the space that you use to record. Yes, yarn is actually a great insulator of sound. If you have a closet full of yarn, that would be a great place to go to record.
Or an office full of yarn.
Right.
That's very, very cool that it doesn't require more than that. And I was going to ask, I've wondered for years about those, the Snowball microphones. Do you have to build a spit screen for them, or do they have enough of a built-in dampener that you don't pop your peas using it?
I think it depends how you speak. For me, I actually did buy a pop guard, which is very inexpensive. I think it was $9 on Amazon to get just a little pop screen. You can actually make them yourself with like an embroidery hoop and some pantyhose. That's all you really need to keep from spitting at the microphone. But I think it depends how you talk and how you speak. Being a female person, have a high-pitched voice, and I tend to talk pretty fast, which I think contributes to more pea-popping sounds than people, who have deeper voices who tend to speak more slowly, because I think the air doesn't come out of their mouths as fast. This is totally unscientific. It's just my observation. I have no idea if this is actually the case.
It sounds really good.
We'll just go with that. But yeah, I did invest in a pop shield, and I found that it helps because what I used to do to avoid the popping sound was to have the microphone sort of at the side of my face rather than speaking directly into it, and that gets a very poor sound quality because that's not the way the microphone picks up sound. The way the microphone picks up sound is to talk into it straight ahead. So when I started doing that, I found I needed to get the pop shield. So that also improved my sound quality. So
what are your favorite books to record?
The book I have coming out, I'll drop in a plug for this. The book I have coming out is a young adult fiction, which was really fun to record because it moved pretty fast. It was very accessible to read and had sort of strong, interesting characters, so you could really get into their voices and their heads. And that was the first time. I mean, it's the first time I had done like modern fiction, because obviously recording for LibriVox, everything is public domain, which is published before 1923. And although I've done some more, some more modern novels for LibriVox, that were published sort of in the early 1920s, it's still, it's almost 100 years ago, and fiction tended to be more wordy and more a little bit more dense, depending on what you get. But it was interesting recording modern fiction for the first time, particularly young adult fiction, which is a genre that I love and read. And this story is called Collapse of the Veil. The author is Alison Lohans, and it is published by a small publishing company, and I believe it's a Canadian publishing company called Bundoran Press, and they do a lot of science fiction, fantasy type of stuff. And the thing I found interesting about this book, again, you know, very different from your public domain type of themes, is that it's about a teenage mother who has a time travel fantasy science fiction adventure. And I found that interesting because, you know, a lot of young adult fiction centers on themes of teenagers and pregnancy and sexuality and stuff like that. But I found very few that actually talk about the experience of being a teenager and having a baby. Usually that's where the book ends. And that this is sort of, the book starts with a 16-year-old who has I think at the beginning of the book, a 9-month-old son. So it's a very interesting book. I would definitely recommend it if you like young adult fiction, if you like science fiction, if you like fantasy. It's got all of that.
What year was it written?
Very recently, I think in 2010, and there is actually a sequel coming out. So as soon as that is published, I will be recording the sequel as well.
Yay! So, and I'm going to make an assumption that this is not with a British accent.
Not with a British accent, no.
Your British accent is lovely.
Oh, thank you.
Really. You and Elizabeth Klett both, I can't tell you, listening to the LibriVox recording of Dracula, how relieved I was every time the two of you came on. It was a joy in those early chapters to be able to go back and forth between the two of you.
Well, she is wonderful. I have worked with her many, many times on LibriVox, and it's strange because you feel like you know somebody that well, because hearing someone's voice is a pretty intimate thing. Yeah. And of course, I've never met her, but I would consider her to be a friend of mine, even though we've never met and never really talked about anything other than LibriVox. That
is very cool. Well, you're going to have to keep sending me the 411 as it rolls in via you, because the as CraftLit being an independent podcast and Just the Books now being an independent podcast, and Madame Defarge coming out from Cooperative Press, an independent publisher, and I've certainly gotten to that point in my life where it's becoming more and more important to support people who are working their butts off and, not necessarily making a living, but putting out good quality stuff.
Definitely.
And so the more I feel like I can let people know about other stuff that they're just not going to hear about on the Today Show.
Right.
The happier I am with all of that. So I'm going to trust you to be my conduit for the next few.
Absolutely. Yeah, and they do have a blog that you can subscribe to just in your RSS or whatever and get updates on what they're publishing. Yeah, the thing I really like about Iambic is that it is curated. It's not just anything. They really, they want to produce good quality audio of good quality books, and they choose the books that they do.
And now it's not just limited to being sold on their website. They also sell to Audible.
They do sell through Audible.
So that's huge.
It's very cool. I would recommend, if you do want to purchase my audio recording or anyone else's, I think it would be great if you went through Iambic directly, just to give them that level of support. But it is great that they are able to reach a broader audience through Audible.
I know it's one of those really, really tricky mid zones, because like Defarge, the designers get a better percentage if people buy What Would Madame Defarge Knit off of the Cooperative Press site or in person at a show. However, it's very important to have your rankings go up on Amazon as it is on Audible. So it's one of those, like, wherever you can buy it, just buy it. Right.
And like my mom, for example, is not going to navigate to the Iambic site. She doesn't know to find that, but she thinks it's very cool if you type my name into Audible, because my mom is a big audiobook listener, always has been ever since you had the books on tape that you had in your car, and you had 47 tapes that you had to keep switching and turning over. So she's always been on Audible, and she thinks it's very cool that you can go to Audible and type in my name and see, a book that I recorded.
It is really cool.
Yeah.
That's just awesome. And now it's, with 6 degrees of separation and all of that, all of the CraftLit people can go, oh, Arielle Lipshaw.
Yeah.
I know Arielle Lipshaw.
Indeed.
That is very, very exciting. All right. Any other LibriVox books that you're particularly proud of that you want people to know about as well?
Oh, if you're looking for an author that you might not have too much experience with, one of my favorites is Susan Glaspell. She was a playwright. She was a contemporary of Eugene O'Neill and worked with Eugene O'Neill at the Provincetown Playhouse. And her very famous play is Trifles, which is a one-act play that a lot of people, I think, have read in school.
I think I remember that. Yeah.
Yep. And we do have a recording of that for LibriVox, but she was also a novelist, and some of her work is public domain and some of it isn't. She was one of those authors that kind of straddled that pre-1923, post-1923 gap. So I have one novel of hers recorded for LibriVox called Fidelity, which is very, very modern in its viewpoint. I think it was written in 1919 or 1920. Should totally recommend. And I think I'm doing a collection of short stories of hers. I really want to record everything of hers that's public domain. I'm kind of going to make her my pet project because people don't know about her and they should.
That is fantastic. It would be great to have you be the voice of a writer that has otherwise been forgotten.
Yeah, she's really very wonderful. The plot of this book, briefly summarize it. Basically, it's a woman who has thrown off the confines of her society in which she grew up, this very sort of insular, middle-class, Midwestern town, and run off with a married man, and has lived with a married man. This is written in 1919, and has lived with a married man for however many years, and comes back to town because her father is dying, and basically the book is about sort of the reactions of the town and what's happened since she's left. But she has a wonderful, just shockingly modern, shockingly relevant speech to her sister about her sister saying, well, come back here. You can leave him. It's not, he's married to someone else. It's not as if you're married to him. You can just walk away from this and come back and live with us. And she says to her sister, we've struggled together, we've cried together, we've lived together for however many years. If that's not a marriage, what's a marriage? And just so relevant to today as far as marriage equality and all this stuff. It was really emotional to read that kind of attitude and that kind of language from someone who was writing, again, so long ago. If you think of what was happening in 1920.
Well, women didn't even have the vote when she started it. Yeah,
just amazing, an amazing writer.
Wow. I'm so excited. Well, Miss Arielle Lipshaw, thank you so much.
It was great to talk to you. I hope we can do this again.
And of course, it being my way, I had to edit out all of the extra conversation because I can get off track. But it turns out that Miss Arielle Lipshaw is also acting. She is in, currently she is in, oh no, I'm going to get it backwards. No, she was in The Tempest. She is now about to be in Macbeth. And so that sparked a whole conversation about Chopbard and about how well Aaron Ziegler breaks those texts down for readers, listeners, viewers, and actors. So there's one plug for Chopbard. You're about to hear another. Misty, who wrote in, which prompted this conversation between Arielle and CraftLit. She was also listening to Aaron Ziegler on Chopbard podcast, and the latest book he did was Macbeth, and he's about to start Richard II. And she said on an extra note to Aaron, which I thought I should read to you because I think it is fascinating, because she is not the only person who said this. She said, I listened to Chopbard, so I'm very familiar with his voice, and yet I didn't realize Aaron was voicing Seward. Only after you mentioned it and I heard him again did I realize it was him. What a convincing voice. I heard the character rather than the actor. High praise indeed. And let's see, another thing that Misty wrote, which I thought was interesting, if you are listening to Chopbard concurrently with CraftLit, Two more thoughts. I finished listening to Macbeth on Chop Bard, and I think that Macbeth and Dracula share the theme of unnaturalness and the perversion of nature. When Macbeth murders Duncan, the natural world is turned upside down and all sorts of horrors occur, including horses eating each other. Dracula's very existence is a perversion of nature. It is so distorted that Dracula falls outside of even the most basic of classifications. He is neither alive nor dead, but undead. Everything surrounding Dracula's movements and actions mess with the reader's basic tenets of, quote-unquote, the way things should work. He defies physics and gravity when he scales walls. He is active at night instead of during the day, and he takes instead of gives. Lucy, once turned vampire, continues the distortion by doing the most quote-unquote unnatural of things, as a woman at the time could do. She hurts children. The voluptuousness and sensual aspect of the women at Dracula's castle, as well as undead Lucy, is another distortion of the quote-unquote natural chasteness of the quote-unquote proper woman. She goes on to say that she listened to episode 235 and appreciated my husband's comments about Stoker being Irish and his viewpoint as an outsider. She said, I think this observation makes several aspects of the story fall more neatly into place. For as much as I believe that the story does contain sexual elements and warnings, it is so much more than that. Stoker was writing a horror story, and he upped the creepiness factor by endangering the reader's basic ideas of how the world worked. No one nowhere was safe, and in the process of writing the story, he got to take some shots at the insiders of the time. The most clean and chaste of English maids ends up being known, in quotation marks, by 4 men. That definitely makes a smirk cross my face. And if memory serves, Dracula may even have his sights on Mina. Well, Misty once again proving my point that CraftLit people are just better. I thought her comments were just spectacular and exactly the kind of thing that we would all be kind of talking about were we to be talking about this book over a glass of wine. However, what you should know is that on that last comment about Dracula and Mina, today, if you keep your ears open, you will hear the setup for the groundwork laid for one of the most shocking and appalling errors any character will commit in this book, setting up the last third. And I am looking forward to your comments in the show notes because I am absolutely undecided about whether Stoker did it this way on purpose to give the girlfriend some props, or if Stoker doesn't realize that this one misstep that is absolutely grounded in the mores and prejudices of the time is where they make their most egregious errors. I've set that up pretty well, right? Now you want to hear the chapters. Even though it's just moving chess piece chapters, now you want to listen. Ha! I am so proud of myself. Just a couple of little factoidish things for you before we start listening to our chapters. One, yes, the undergrounds were working in London at the time. The trains first started running in 1863. Some of them were in tunnels. Some of them were merely between high walls going through different districts in London. By 1896, over 110 million riders a year used the underground. How rockin' is that? 1863 it started. London was the first city in the world to build underground railway stations. At one point, Mina will talk about putting forked metal to her ears while listening to Dr. Seward's phonograph or gramophone phonograph. This is a headset, kind of a primitive headset, so she can listen privately. My first image was of a tuning fork, on a tube that went into the phonograph. I do not know if that is true or not, but I've been looking for a picture of this particular headset and I cannot find one. So if you find one, please put a link in the show notes so that everybody can see the genius that is you and the headset that you were able to find. Manifold paper. Both my husband and I were close, but distinctly incorrect in what we thought manifold meant. Now, manifold, has taken on new meanings, but in its older and original sense, manifold was thin sheets of paper that were interleaved with carbon paper. They were invented in the early 19th century. So if you had a very hard pen or a pencil or eventually a typewriter, then you could make carbon copies very easily. So manifold paper is, if you are old enough to remember what school secretaries used during the 70s, pieces of paper that had carbon paper in between so they could make things in triplicate instead of having to retype everything because photocopy machines were not available yet, although mimeograph machines were. That's what they would have used, is manifold paper. Telephones. Telephones did exist. Alexander Graham Bell first invented the telephone in 1876, and then Alman Stroweger patented the first direct dial telephone in 1889. Now, London's communications were handled mainly by the National Television. I need to sleep more. By the National Telephone Company, which maintained numerous call rooms throughout London and its districts. Those rooms were open to the public at a rate of 3 pence for each 3 minutes of conversation. Many businesses relied on the telephone, and the 1885 United Telephone Company's Professional and Trades Classified Directory, try saying that in your sleep, listed thousands of subscribers. So there were telephones. So when you hear people talk about telephones, you were very comfortable with the telegraph, right? Telegraph, fine. Trains, fine. Underground, fine. Telephone, it was going to bug you. But they actually did exist. And so with that, I'm going to play a chapter 17. I will give you a few more little bits and pieces before chapter 18, and then I have one big and kind of important comment at the end. So here we go with chapter 17 of Dracula.
Dr. Seward's diary continued. When we arrived at the Berkeley Hotel, Van Helsing found a telegram waiting for him. Am coming up by train. Jonathan and Whitby. Important news. Mina Harker. The professor was delighted. Ah, that wonderful Madam Mina, he said. Pearl among women. She arrive, but I cannot stay. She must go to your house, friend John. You must meet her at the station. Telegraph her en route so that she may be prepared. When the wire was dispatched, he had a cup of tea. Over it he told me of a diary kept by Jonathan Harker when abroad, and gave me a typewritten copy of it, as also of Mrs. Harker's diary at Whitby. Take these, he said, and study them well. When I have returned, you will be master of all the facts, and we can then better enter on our inquisition. Keep them safe, for there is in them much of treasure. You will need all your faith, even you who have had such an experience as that of today. What is here told, he laid his hand heavily and gravely on the packet of papers as he spoke, may be the beginning of the end to you and me and many others, or it may sound the knell of the undead who walk the earth. Read all, I pray you, with the open mind, and if you can add in any way to the story here told, do so, for it is all important. You have kept a diary of all these so strange things, is it not so? Yes. Then we shall go through all these together when we meet. He then made ready for his departure, and shortly drove off to Liverpool Street. I took my way to Paddington, where I arrived about 15 minutes before the train came in. The crowd melted away after the bustling fashion common to arrival platforms, and I was beginning to feel uneasy lest I might miss my quest, when a sweet-faced, dainty-looking girl stepped up to me, and after a quick glance said, "Dr. Seward, is it not?" "And you are Mrs. Harker," I answered at once, whereupon she held out her hand. "I knew you from the description of poor dear Lucy, but—" She stopped suddenly, and a quick blush overspread her face. The blush that rose to my own cheek somehow set us both at ease, for it was a tacit answer to her own. I got her luggage, which included a typewriter, and we took the Underground to Fenchurch Street, after I had sent a wire to my housekeeper to have a sitting room and a bedroom prepared at once for Mrs. Harker. In due time, we arrived. She knew, of course, that the place was a lunatic asylum, but I could see that she was unable to repress a shudder when we entered. She told me that, if she might, she would come presently to my study, as she had much to say. so here I am finishing my entry in my phonograph diary whilst I wait her. As yet, I have not had the chance of looking at the papers which Van Helsing left with me, though they lie open before me. I must get her interested in something so that I may have an opportunity of reading them. She does not know how precious time is, or what a task we have in hand. I must be careful not to frighten her. Here she is.
Mina Harker's journal.
29th September. After I had tidied myself, I went down to Dr. Seward's study. At the door I paused a moment, for I thought I heard him talking with someone. As, however, he had pressed me to be quick, I knocked at the door, and on his calling out, "Come in," I entered. To my intense surprise, there was no one with him. He was quite alone, and on the table opposite him was what I knew at once from the description to be a phonograph. I had never seen one, and was much interested. "I hope I did not keep you waiting," I said, "but I stayed at the door as I heard you talking, and thought there was someone with you." "Oh," he replied with a smile, "I was only entering my diary." "Your diary?" I asked him in surprise. "Yes," he answered, "I keep it in this." As he spoke, he laid his hand on the phonograph. I felt quite excited over it, and blurted out, "Why, this beats even shorthand. May I hear it say something?" "Certainly," he replied with alacrity, and stood up to put it in train for speaking. Then he paused, and a troubled look overspread his face. "The fact is," he began awkwardly, "I only keep my diary in it, and as it is entirely, almost entirely, about my cases, it may be awkward. That is, I mean—" He stopped, and I tried to help him out of his embarrassment. "You helped to attend dear Lucy at the end. Let me hear how she died. For all that I know of her, I shall be very grateful. She was very, very dear to me." To my surprise, he answered with a horror-struck look in his face, "Tell you of her death? Not for the wide world." "Why not?" I asked, for some grave, terrible feeling was coming over me. Again he paused, and I could see that he was trying to invent an excuse. At length he stammered out, "You see, I do not know how to pick out any particular part of the diary." Even while he was speaking, an idea dawned upon him, and he said with unconscious simplicity, in a different voice, and with the naivete of a child, "That's quite true, upon my honour. Honest Indian." I could not but smile, at which he grimaced. "I gave myself away that time," he said. "But do you know that, although I have kept the diary for months past, it never once struck me how I was going to find any particular part of it in case I wanted to look it up?" By this time my mind was made up that the diary of a doctor who attended Lucy might have something to add to the sum of our knowledge of that terrible being, and I said boldly, "Then, Dr. Seward, you had better let me copy it out for you on my typewriter." He grew to a positively deathly pallor as he said, "No, no, no, for all the world. I wouldn't let you know that terrible story." Then it was terrible. My intuition was right. For a moment I thought, and as my eyes ranged the room, unconsciously looking for something or some opportunity to aid me, they lit on a great batch of typewriting on the table. His eyes caught the look in mine, and without his thinking followed their direction. As they saw the parcel, he realized my meaning. "You do not know me," I said. "When you have read those papers, my own diary and my husband's also, which I have typed, you will know me better. I have not faltered in giving every thought of my own heart in this cause. But of course you do not know me yet, and I must not expect you to trust me so far." He is certainly a man of noble nature. Poor dear Lucy was right about him. He stood up and opened a large drawer, in which were arranged in order a number of hollow cylinders of metal covered with dark wax, and said, "You are quite right. I did not trust you because I did not know you. But I know you now, and let me say that I should have known you long ago. I know that Lucy told you of me. She told me of you too. May I make the only atonement in my power? Take the cylinders and hear them. The first half-dozen of them are personal to me, and they will not horrify you. Then you will know me better. Dinner will by then be ready. In the meantime I shall read over some of these documents, and shall be better able to understand certain things." He carried the phonograph himself up to my sitting-room and adjusted it for me. Now I shall learn something pleasant, I am sure, for it will tell me the other side of a true love episode of which I know one side already.
Dr. Seward's Diary, 29 September. I was so absorbed in that wonderful diary of Jonathan Harker and that other of his wife that I let the time run out without thinking. Mrs. Harker was not down when the maid came to announce dinner, so I said, "She is possibly tired. Let dinner wait an hour," and I went on with my work. I had just finished Mrs. Harker's diary when she came in. She looked sweetly pretty, but very sad, and her eyes were flushed with crying. This somehow moved me much. Of late I have had cause for tears, God knows, but the relief of them was denied me, and now the sight of those sweet eyes, brightened by recent tears, went straight to my heart. So I said, as gently as I could, "I greatly fear I have distressed you." "Oh, no, not distressed me," she replied, "but I have been more touched than I can say by your grief. That is a wonderful machine, but it is cruelly true. It told me in its very tones the anguish of your heart. It was like a soul crying out to Almighty God. No one must hear them spoken ever again. See, I have tried to be useful. I have copied out those words on my typewriter, and none other need now hear your heartbeat as I did. No one need ever know, shall ever know," I said in a low voice. She laid her hand on mine and said very gravely, "Ah, but they must." "Must? But why?" I asked. "Because it is a part of the terrible story, a part of poor Lucy's death and all that led to it. Because in the struggle which we have before us to rid the earth of this terrible monster, we must have all the knowledge and all the help which we can get. I think that the cylinders which you gave me contained more than you intended me to know. But I can see that there are in your record many lights to this dark mystery. You will let me help, will you not? I know all, up to a certain point, and I see already, though your diary only took me to 7 September, how poor Lucy was beset, and how her terrible doom was being wrought out. Jonathan and I have been working day and night since Professor Van Helsing saw us. He's gone to Whitby to get more information, and he will be here tomorrow to help us. We need have no secrets amongst us. Working together and with absolute trust, we can surely be stronger than if some of us were in the dark." She looked at me so appealingly, and at the same time manifested such courage and resolution in her bearing, that I gave in at once to her wishes. "You shall," I said, "do as you like in the matter. God forgive me if I do wrong. There are terrible things yet to learn of, but if you have so far travelled on the road to poor Lucy's death, you will not be content, I know, to remain in the dark. Nay, the end, the very end, may give you a gleam of peace. Come, there is dinner. We must keep one another strong for what is before us. We have a cruel and dreadful task. When you have eaten, you shall learn the rest, and I shall answer any question you ask, if there be anything which you do not understand, though it was apparent to us who were present."
Mina Harker's journal.
29th September. After dinner I came with Dr. Seward to his study. He brought back the phonograph from my room, and I took a chair, and arranged the phonograph so that I could touch it without getting up, and showed me how to stop it in case I should want to pause. Then he very thoughtfully took a chair with his back to me, so that I might be as free as possible, and began to read. I put the forked metal to my ears and listened. When the terrible story of Lucy's death and all that followed was done, I lay back in my chair powerless. Fortunately, I am not of a fainting disposition. When Dr. Seward saw me, he jumped up with a horrified exclamation, and hurriedly taking a case bottle from the cupboard, gave me some brandy, which in a few minutes somewhat restored me. My brain was all in a whirl, and only that there came through all the multitude of horrors the holy ray of light that my dear Lucy was at last at peace. I do not think I could have borne it without making a scene. It is all so wild and mysterious and strange that if I had not known Jonathan's experience in Transylvania, I could not have believed. As it was, I didn't know what to believe, and so got out of my difficulty by attending to something else. I took the cover off my typewriter and said to Dr. Seward, "Let me write this all out now. We must be ready for Dr. Van Helsing when he comes. I have sent a telegram to Jonathan to come on here when he arrives in London from Whitby. In this matter dates are everything, and I think that if we get all of our material ready, and have every item put in chronological order, we shall have done much. You tell me that Lord Godalming and Mr. Morris are coming too. Let us be able to tell them when they come." He accordingly set the phonograph at a slow pace, and I began to typewrite from the beginning of the 17th cylinder. I used manifold, and so took 3 copies of the diary, just as I had done with the rest. It was late when I got through, but Dr. Seward went about his work of going his round of the patients. When he had finished, he came back and sat near me, reading, so that I did not feel too lonely whilst I worked. How good and thoughtful he is! The world seems full of good men, even if there are monsters in it. Before I left him, I remembered what Jonathan put in his diary of the Professor's perturbation at reading something in an evening paper at the station at Exeter, so seeing that Dr. Seward keeps his newspapers, I borrowed the files of the Westminster Gazette and the Pall Mall Gazette, and took them to my room. I remember how much the Daily Graph and the Whitby Gazette, of which I had made cuttings, had helped us to understand the terrible events at Whitby when Count Dracula landed, so I shall look through the evening papers since then, and perhaps I shall get some new light. I am not sleepy, and the work will help to keep me quiet.
Dr. Seward's Diary, 30 September. Mr. Harker arrived at 9 o'clock. He got his wife's wire just before starting. He is uncommonly clever, if one can judge from his face, and full of energy. If this journal be true, and judging by one's own wonderful experiences it must be, he is also a man of great nerve. That going down to the vault a second time was a remarkable piece of daring. After reading his account of it, I was prepared to meet a good specimen of manhood, but hardly the quiet, business-like gentleman who came here today. Later, after lunch, Harker and his wife went back to their own room, and as I passed a while ago, I heard the click of the typewriter. They are hard at it. Mrs. Harker says that knitting together in chronological order every scrap of evidence they have. Harker has got the letters between the consignee of the boxes at Whitby and the carriers in London who took charge of them. He is now reading his wife's transcript of the diary. I wonder what they make of it. Here it is. Strange that it never struck me that the very next house might be the Count's hiding place. Goodness knows that we had enough clues from the conduct of the patient Renfield. The bundle of letters relating to the purchase of the house were with the transcript. Oh, if we had only had them earlier, we might have saved poor Lucy. Stop. That way madness lies. Harker has gone back and is again collecting material. He says that by dinner time they will be able to show a whole connected narrative. He thinks that in the meantime I should see Renfield, as hitherto he has been a sort of index to the coming and going of the Count. I hardly see this yet, but when I get at the dates I suppose I shall. What a good thing that Mrs. Harker put my cylinders into type. We never could have found the dates otherwise. I found Renfield sitting placidly in his room, with his hands folded, smiling benignly. At the moment, he seems as sane as anyone I ever saw. I sat down and talked with him on a lot of subjects, all of which he treated naturally. He then, of his own accord, spoke of going home, a subject he has never mentioned to my knowledge during his sojourn here. In fact, he spoke quite confidently of getting his discharge at once. I believe that had I not had the chat with Harker and read the letters and dates of his outbursts, I should have been prepared to sign for him after a brief time of observation. As it is, I am darkly suspicious. All those outbreaks were in some way linked with the proximity of the Count. What then does this absolute content mean? Can it be that his instinct is satisfied as to the vampire's ultimate triumph? Stay, he is himself zoophagous, and in his wild ravings outside the chapel door of the deserted house, he always spoke of master. This all seems confirmation of our idea. However, after a while I came away. My friend is just a little too sane at present to make it safe to probe him too deeply with questions. He might begin to think, and then... So I came away. I mistrust these quiet moods of his, so I have given the attendant a hint to look closely after him, and to have a strait waistcoat ready in case of need.
Jonathan Harker's Journal, 29th of September, in train to London. When I received Mr. Billington's courteous message that he would give me any information in his power, I thought it best to go to Whitby and make, on the spot, such inquiries as I wanted. It was now my object to trace that horrid cargo of the Count's to its place in London. Later we may be able to deal with it. Billington Jr., a nice lad, met me at the station and brought me to his father's house, where they had decided that I must stay the night. They are hospitable, with true Yorkshire personality, give everything and leave him free to do as he likes. They all knew I was busy and that my stay was short, and Mr. Billington had ready in his office all the papers concerning the consignment of boxes. It gave me almost a turn to see again one of the letters which I had seen on the counter table before I knew of his diabolical plans. Everything had been carefully thought out and done systematically and with precision. He seemed to have been prepared for every obstacle which might be placed by accident in the way of his intentions being carried out. To use an Americanism, he had taken no chances, and the absolute accuracy with which his instructions were fulfilled were simply the logistical result of his care. I saw the invoice and took note of it, 50 cases of common earth to be used for experimental purposes. Also the copy of letter to Carter Paterson, and the reply. Of both of these I got copies. This was all the information Mr. Billington could give me, so I went down to the port and saw the coast guards, the customs officers, and the harbour master. They all had something to say of the strange entry of the ship, which is already taking its place in local tradition, but no one could add to the simple description. 50 cases of common earth. I then saw the station master, who kindly put me in communication with the men who actually received the boxes. Their tally was exact with the list, and they had nothing to add except that the boxes were main and mortal heavy, and that shifting them was dry work. One of them added that it was hard lines, that there wasn't any gentleman, such as like yourself, squire, to show some sort of appreciation of their efforts in a liquid form. Another put in a rider that the thirst then generated was such that even the time which had elapsed had not completely allayed it. Needless to add, I took care before leaving to lift, forever and adequately, this source of reproach. 30th of September. The station master was good enough to give me a line to his old companion, the station master at King's Cross, so that when I arrived there in the morning I was able to ask him about the arrival of the boxes. He, too, put me at once in communication with the proper officials, and I saw that their tally was correct with the original invoice. The opportunities of acquiring an abnormal thirst had been here limited. A noble use of them had, however, been made, and again I was compelled to deal with the result in an ex post facto manner. From thence I went on to Carter Paterson's central office, where I met with the utmost courtesy. They looked up from their transactions in their day-book and letter-book, and at once telephoned to their King's Cross office for more details. By good fortune, the men who did the teaming were waiting for work, and the official at once sent them over, sending also by one of them the way-bill and all the papers concerned with the delivery of the boxes at Carfax. Here again I found the tally agreeing exactly. The carrier's men were able to supplement the paucity of the written words with a few details. These were, I shortly found, connected almost solely with the dusty nature of the job, and of the consequent thirst engendered in the operators. On my affording an opportunity through the medium of the currency of the realm, of the allaying it of a later period, this beneficent evil, one of the men remarked, "That here house, governor, is the rammest I ever was in, blime, but it ain't been touched since 100 years. There was dust that thick in the place you might have slept on it without the hurting of your bones. And the place was that neglected you might have smelt old Jerusalem in it. But the old chapel, that took the cake, that did. Me and my mate, we thought we wouldn't get out there quick enough, lad. I wouldn't take less nor a quid to stay there after dark." Having been in the house, I could well believe him, but if he knew what I knew, he would, I think, have raised his terms. Of one thing I am now satisfied, that all the boxes which arrived at Whitby from Varna in the Demeter were safely deposited in the old chapel of Carfax. There should be 50 of them there, unless any have since been removed, as from Dr. Seward's diary, I fear. I shall try to see the carter who took away the boxes from Carfax when Renfield attacked them. By following up this clue we may learn a good deal. Later. Mina and I have worked all day, and we have put all the papers into order.
Mina Harker's journal.
30th September. I am so glad that I hardly know how to contain myself. It is, I suppose, the reaction from the haunting fear which I have had, that this terrible affair and the reopening of his old wound might act detrimentally on Jonathan. I saw him leave for Whitby with as brave a face as could, but I was sick with apprehension. The effort has, however, done him good. He was never so resolute, never so strong, never so full of volcanic energy as at present. It is just as that dear good Professor Van Helsing said, he is true grit, and he improves under strain that would kill a weaker nature. He came back full of life and hope and determination. We have got everything in order for tonight. I feel myself quite wild with excitement. I suppose one ought to pity anything so hunted as the Count. That is just it. The thing is not human, not even a beast. To read Dr. Seward's account of poor Lucy's death and what followed is enough to dry up the springs of pity in one's heart. Later. Lord Godalming and Mr. Morris arrived earlier than we expected. Dr. Seward was out on business and had taken Jonathan with him, so I had to see them. It was to me a painful meeting, for it brought back all poor dear Lucy's hopes of only a few months ago. Of course they had heard Lucy speak of me, and it seemed that Dr. Van Helsing too had been quite blowing my trumpet, as Mr. Morris expressed it. Poor fellows, neither of them is aware that I know all about the proposals they made to Lucy. They did not quite know what to say or do, as they were ignorant of the amount of my knowledge, so they had to keep on neutral subjects. However, I thought the matter over, and came to the conclusion that the best thing I could do would be to post them on affairs right up to date. I knew from Dr. Seward's diary that they had been at Lucy's death, her real death, and that I need not fear to betray any secret before the time. So I told them as well as I could that I had read all the papers and diaries, and that my husband and I, having typewritten them, had just finished putting them in order. I gave them each a copy to read in the library. When Lord Godalming got his and turned it over, it does make a pretty good pile. He said, "Did you write all this, Mrs. Harker?" I nodded, and he went on. "I don't quite see the drift of it, but you people are all so good and kind, and have been working so earnestly and so energetically, that all I can do is to accept your ideas blindfold and try to help you. I have had one lesson already in accepting facts that should make a man humble to the last hour of his life. Besides, I know you loved my Lucy." Here he turned away and covered his face with his hands. I could hear the tears in his voice. Mr. Morris, with instinctive delicacy, just laid a hand for a moment on his shoulder, and then walked quietly out of the room. I suppose there is something in a woman's nature that makes a man free to break down before her, and express his feelings on the tender or emotional side, without feeling it derogatory to his manhood. For when Lord Godalming found himself alone with me, he sat down on the sofa and gave way utterly and openly. I sat down beside him and took his hand. I hope he didn't think it forward of me, and that if he ever thinks of it afterwards, he never will have such a thought. There I wrong him. I know he never will. He is too true a gentleman. I said to him, for I could see that his heart was breaking, "I loved dear Lucy, and I know what she was to you, and what you were to her. She and I were like sisters, and now she is gone. Will you not let me be like a sister to you in your trouble? I know what sorrows you have had, though I cannot measure the depth of them. If sympathy and pity can help in your affliction, won't you let me be of some little service, for Lucy's sake?" In an instant the poor dear fellow was overwhelmed with grief. It seemed to me that all that he had been of late suffering in silence found a vent at once. He grew quite hysterical, and raising his open hands, beat his palms together in a perfect agony of grief. He stood up and then sat down again, and the tears rained down his cheeks. I felt an infinite pity for him, and opened my arms unthinkingly. With a sob he laid his head on my shoulder, and cried like a wearied child, whilst he shook with emotion. We women have something of the mother in us that makes us rise above smaller matters, when the mother spirit is invoked. I felt this big, sorrowing man's head resting on me, as though it were that of a baby that some day may lie on my bosom, and I stroked his hair as though he were my own child. I never thought at the time how strange it all was. After a little bit his sobs ceased, and he raised himself with an apology, though he made no disguise of his emotion. He told me that for days and nights past, weary days and sleepless nights, he had been unable to speak with anyone, as a man must speak in his time of sorrow. There was no woman whose sympathy could be given to him, or with whom, owing to the terrible circumstance with which his sorrow was surrounded, he could speak freely. "I know now how I have suffered," he said as he dried his eyes, "but I do not know even yet, and none other can ever know, how much your sweet sympathy has been to me to-day. I shall know better in time, and believe me that, though I am not ungrateful now, my gratitude will grow with my understanding. You will let me be like a brother, will you not, for all our lives, for dear Lucy's sake?" "For dear Lucy's sake," I said as we clasped hands. "Ay, and for your own sake," he added. "For if a man's esteem and gratitude are ever worth the winning, you have won mine today. If ever the future should bring you to a time when you need a man's help, believe me you will not call in vain. God grant that no such time may ever come to you to break the sunshine of your life, but if it should ever come, promise me that you will let me know." He was so earnest, and his sorrow was so fresh, that I felt it would comfort him, so I said, "I promise." As I came along the corridor, I saw Mr. Morris looking out of a window. He turned as he heard my footsteps. "How is art?" he said. Then noticing my red eyes, he went on, "Ah, I see you have been comforting him. Poor old fellow, he needs it. No one but a woman can help a man when he is in trouble of the heart, and he had no one to comfort him." He bore his own trouble so bravely that my heart bled for him. I saw the manuscript in his hand, and I knew that when he read it he would realize how much I knew. So I said to him, "I wish I could comfort all who suffer from the heart. Will you let me be your friend, and will you come to me for comfort if you need it? You will know later why I speak." He saw that I was in earnest, and stooping took my hand and raising it to his lips, kissed it. It seemed but poor comfort to so brave and unselfish a soul, and impulsively I bent over and kissed him. The tears rose in his eyes, and there was a momentary choking in his throat. He said quite calmly, "Little girl, you will never forget that true-hearted kindness, so long as ever you live." Then he went into the study to his friend. Little girl, the very words he had used to Lucy, and oh, but he proved himself a friend.
Well, there's a rare bit of kind of obvious foreshadowing, but it is interesting that foreshadowing shows up in Mina's narrative at all. Or is it? Depending on how you read that last sentence, it is either, oh, but Quincy had proved himself a friend in helping to dispatch Lucy in such a way that her immortal soul was reconciled, relieved of its burden of undeaditude, or however you choose to see it. Or it could be read as foreshadowing of how good a friend Quincy Morris would prove to be. Now, there is a whole subculture out there in the big bad world that believes that Dracula is fact, and that Stoker really did take all of the diaries, journals, and papers, those papers that Mina has now typed up, and that he obfuscated real names and real places and tried to make it look like fiction, when in fact it was a real story about a real vampire hunt. Now, I leave it to you to make your decision about that. To me, that's kind of like this new documentary that I just read about, looking at whether Stanley Kubrick had embedded all sorts of hidden meanings in the movie The Shining, and had hinted at or given proof about how he filmed the faked Apollo 11 landing on the moon. And it just cracks me up. The idea that anyone in our government could ever achieve anything so remarkably well contained as a ginormous secret like faking the moon landing. I worked at the Department of Education, and the individual people there are stunning. They're fabulous people. But the layers of bureaucracy and rules that are placed on them by Congress make it very difficult to, do much. I mean, you do as much as you can. But I think really it's the idea that anyone could keep a secret like that all this time cracks me up. And ditto Dracula. I mean, seriously, if this dude was walking around, I think we'd know. I mean, there were certainly enough hints being dropped here The wolves were in the paper, the ship was in the paper, all that stuff. I'm not reading a whole lot about strange blood loss victims, except for our own listener. But that was not because of a vampire. Anyway, I just thought I should remind you that you are now part of a vast literary conspiracy. part of the true believers that Dracula walks among us. Anyway, chapter 18, Things You'll Need to Know. If you haven't already heard it go by, Renfield, Dr. Seward's patient, is often called the Flyman, and he is often referred to as Zooophagus. And Zooophagus means it means carnivorous. It's something, sometimes a plant like a Venus flytrap, or in this case, a living creature like Renfield, who feeds on animal matter, which is pretty gross. But that's all it means, is he eats protein-ish things. That just grosses me out. It really gives me the creeps, which I know it's supposed to, and it really, really does. Now, what you are about to listen to is, I think, my favorite Renfield scene ever. And I will just let it go at that. But you do need to know a few things. He starts spewing Latin again, legal Latin. And so a couple of legal phrases that he uses are non causae, which means there's no cause, there's no reason, and ignoratio elenchi, which means ignorance of the charge. So that's one thing to file away. Now, there is a curious one, and I think this actually goes along with the in the proof category for people who think that Dracula is fact, nonfiction, and not fiction. And that is that there was a snake oil salesman, for lack of a better term, that put out something called Clark's world-famed blood mixture. Now, this is called a nostrum by Renfield, and a nostrum is it's in the U.S. we call it snake oil. It's a medicine, but it is a medicine that has been mixed, marketed, created by someone who is largely unqualified to have done that. So this is a so-called blood purifier. It was probably tequila, or it wouldn't have been tequila, but something alcoholic, something that would have had a kick and made you feel that your blood was being purified. Their advertisement for Clark's world-famed blood mixture was, "For the blood is the life." All right? And when did that come out? At least one of the advertisements was out in 1890, right before Bram Stoker started writing this down. Okay, so that's one of the things that Renfield is talking about that would have just flown right past you and wouldn't have made any sense. Okay, much of what you will hear in chapter 18 is a laundry list recapping by Van Helsing of what we have learned so far about vampires. And it's not just what we have learned, but it's kind of an information dump that Stoker is utilizing here to make sure everybody's on the same page about what vampires can do. Now, this being one of those moments, I think, where when a normal human is confronted by unhuman, inhuman, otherworldly things, there's what we know, and there's what we think we know. And therefore, it is possible that not everything that Van Helsing says is true. And that sets up an awful lot of interesting possibilities for how our heroes will behave in the future and whether or not they will be successful. And I think it's a marvelous thing for Stoker to have created a character who is an expert, believes himself an expert, is actually the only one among them who actually has a clue, and yet he may not be entirely right. Isn't that awesome? And on that note, I turn you over to the capable hands of our readers for chapter 18.
Dr. Seward's Diary, 30 September. I got home at 5 o'clock and found that Godalming and Morris had not only arrived, but had already studied the transcripts of the various diaries and letters which Harker and his wonderful wife had made and arranged. Harker had not yet returned from his visit to the carrier's men, of whom Dr. Hennessy had written to me. Mrs. Harker gave us a cup of tea, and I can honestly say that for the first time since I have lived in it, this old house seemed like home. When we had finished, Mrs. Harker said, "Dr. Seward, may I ask a favor? I want to see your patient, Mr. Renfield. Do let me see him. What you have said of him in your diary interests me so much." She looked so appealing and so pretty that I could not refuse her, and there was no possible reason why I should, so I took her with me. When I went into the room, I told the man that a lady would like to see him, to which he simply answered, "Why?" "She is going through the house and wants to see everyone in it," I answered. "Oh, very well," he said. "Let her come in, by all means, but just wait a minute while I tidy up the place." His method of tidying was peculiar. He simply swallowed all the flies and spiders in the boxes before I could stop him. It was quite evident that he feared or was jealous of some interference. When he had got through his disgusting task, he said cheerfully, "Let the lady come in," and sat down on the edge of his bed with his head down, but with his eyelids raised so that he could see her as she entered. For a moment I thought that he might have some homicidal intent. I remembered how quiet he had been just before he attacked me in my own study, and I took care to stand where I could seize him at once if he attempted to make a spring at her. She came into the room with an easy gracefulness which would at once command the respect of any lunatic, for easiness is one of the qualities mad people most respect. She walked over to him, smiling pleasantly, and held out her hand. "Good evening, Mr. Renfield," she said. "You see, I know you, for Dr. Seward has told me of you." He made no immediate reply, but eyed her all over intently with a set frown on his face. This look gave way to one of wonder, which merged into doubt, and then to my intense astonishment he said, "You're not the girl the doctor wanted to marry, are you? You can't be, you know, for she's dead." Mrs. Harker smiled sweetly as she replied, "Oh no, I have a husband of my own, to whom I was married before I ever saw Dr. Seward, or he me. I am Mrs. Harker." "Then what are you doing here?" "My husband and I are staying on a visit with Dr. Seward." "Then don't stay." "But why not?" I thought that this style of conversation might not be pleasant to Mrs. Harker any more than it was to me, so I joined in. "How did you know I wanted to marry anyone?" His reply was simply contemptuous, given in a pause in which he turned his eyes from Mrs. Harker to me, instantly turning them back again. "What an asinine question." "I don't see that at all, Mr. Renfield," said Mrs. Harker, at once championing me. He replied to her with as much courtesy and respect as he had shown contempt to me. "You will, of course, understand, Mrs. Harker, that when a man is so loved and honoured as our host is, everything regarding him is of interest in our little community. Dr. Seward is loved not only by his household and his friends, but even by his patients, whom, being some of them hardly in mental equilibrium, are apt to distort causes and effects. Since I myself have been an inmate of a lunatic asylum, I cannot but notice that the sophisticate tendencies of some of its inmates lean towards the errors of non causa and ignoratio elenchi." I positively opened my eyes at this new development. Here was my own pet lunatic, the most pronounced of his type that I had ever met with, talking elemental philosophy and with the manner of a polished gentleman. I wonder if it was Mrs. Harker's presence which had touched some chord in his memory. If this new phase was spontaneous, or in any way due to her unconscious influence, she must have some rare gift or power. We continued to talk for some time, and seeing that he was seemingly quite reasonable, she ventured, looking at me questioningly as she began, to lead him to his favorite topic. I was again astonished, for he addressed himself to the question with the impartiality of the completest sanity. He even took himself as an example when he mentioned certain things. "Why, I myself am an instance of a man who had a strange belief. Indeed, it was no wonder that my friends were alarmed and insisted on my being put under control. I used to fancy that life was a positive and perpetual entity, and that by consuming a multitude of live things, no matter how low in the scale of creation, one might indefinitely prolong life. At times I held the belief so strongly that I actually tried to take human life. The doctor here will bear me out that on one occasion I tried to kill him for the purpose of strengthening my vital powers by the assimilation with my body of his life through the medium of his blood, relying, of course, upon the scriptural phrase, "For the blood is the life." Though, indeed, the vendor of a certain nostrum has vulgarized the truism to the very point of contempt. Isn't that true, Doctor? I nodded assent, for I was so amazed that I hardly knew what to either think or say. It was hard to imagine that I had seen him eat up his spiders and flies not 5 minutes before. Looking at my watch, I saw that I should go to the station to meet Van Helsing, so I told Mrs. Harker that it was time to leave. She came at once after saying pleasantly to Mr. Renfield, "Goodbye, and I hope I may see you often under auspices pleasanter to yourself." To which, to my astonishment, he replied, "Goodbye, my dear. I pray I may never see your sweet face again. May he bless and keep you." When I went to the station to meet Van Helsing, I left the boys behind me. Poor Art seemed more cheerful than he has been since Lucy first took ill, and Quincy is more like his own bright self than he has been for many a long day. Van Helsing stepped from the carriage with the eager nimbleness of a boy. He saw me at once and rushed up to me, saying, "Ah, friend John, how goes all? Well? So, I have been busy, for I come here to stay if need be. All affairs are settled with me, and I have much to tell. Madam Mina is with you?" "Yes, and her so fine husband? And Arthur and my friend Quincy, they are with you too? Good." As I drove to the house, I told him of what had passed, and of how my own diary had come to be of some use through Mrs. Harker's suggestion, at which the professor interrupted me. "Ah, that wonderful Madam Mina. She has man's brain, a brain that a man should have were he much gifted, and a woman's heart. The good God fashioned her for a purpose, believe me, when he made that so good combination. Friend John, up to now, fortune has made that woman of help to us. After tonight, she must not have to do with this terrible affair. It is not good that she run a risk so great. We men are determined, nay, are we not pledged to destroy this monster? But it is no part for a woman. Even if she be not harmed, her heart may fail her in so much and so many horrors, and after she may suffer, both in waking from her nerves and in sleep from her dreams. And besides, she is a young woman and not so long married. There may be other things to think of sometime, if not now. You tell me she has wrote all, then she must consult with us, but tomorrow she say goodbye to this work and we go alone." I agreed heartily with him, and then I told him what we had found in his absence, that the house which Dracula had bought was the very next one to my own. He was amazed, and a great concern seemed to come on him. "Oh, that we had known it before," he said, "for then we might have reached him in time to save poor Lucy. However, the milk that is spilt cries not out afterwards, as you say. We shall not think of that, but go on our way to the end." He then fell into a silence that lasted till we entered my own gateway. Before we went to prepare for dinner, he said to Mrs. Harker, "I am told, Madam Mina, by my friend John, that you and your husband have put up in exact order all things that have been up to this moment." "Not up to this moment, Professor," she said impulsively, "but up to this morning." "But why not up till now? We have seen hitherto how good light all the little things have made. We have told our secrets, and yet no one who has told is the worse for it." Mrs. Harker began to blush, and taking a paper from her pocket, she said, "Dr. Van Helsing, will you read this and tell me if it must go in? It is my record of today. I too have seen the need of putting down at present everything, however trivial, but there is little in this except what is personal. Must it go in?" The professor read it over gravely and handed it back, saying, "It need not go in if you do not wish it, but I pray that it may. It can but make your husband love you the more, and all us, your friends, more honor you, as well as more esteem and love." She took it back with another blush and a bright smile. "And so now, up to this very hour, all the records we have are complete and in order. The professor took away one copy to study after dinner and before our meeting, which is fixed for 9 o'clock. The rest of us have already read everything, so when we meet in the study we shall all be informed as to facts and can arrange our plan of battle with this terrible and mysterious enemy."
Mina Harker's journal.
30th September. When we met in Dr. Seward's study 2 hours after dinner, which had been at 6 o'clock, we unconsciously formed a sort of board or committee. Professor Van Helsing took the head of the table, to which Dr. Seward motioned him as he came into the room. He made me sit next to him on his right, and asked me to act as secretary. Jonathan sat next to me. Opposite us were Lord Godalming, Dr. Seward, and Mr. Morris, Lord Godalming being next to the professor, and Dr. Seward in the centre. The professor said, "I may, I suppose, take it that we are all acquainted with the facts that are in these papers?" We all expressed assent, and he went on. "Then it were, I think, good that I tell you something of the kind of enemy with which we have to deal. I shall then make known to you something of the history of this man, which has been ascertained for me. So we then can discuss how we shall act, and can take our measure according. There are such beings as vampires. Some of us have evidence that they exist. Even had we not the proof of our own unhappy experience, the teachings and the records of the past give proof enough for sane peoples. I admit that at the first I was sceptic. Were it not that through long years I have trained myself to keep an open mind, I could not have believed until such time as that fact thunder on my ear. See, see, I prove, I prove. Alas, had I known at first what I know now, nay, had I even guessed at him, one so precious life had been spared to many of us who did love her. But that is gone, and we must so work that other poor souls perish not whilst we can save. The Nosferatu do not die like the bee when he sting once. He is only stronger, and being stronger have yet more power to work evil. This vampire which is amongst us is of himself so strong in person as 20 men. He is of cunning more than mortal, for his cunning be the growth of ages. He have still the aids of necromancy, which is, as his etymology imply, the divination by the dead, and all the dead that he can come nigh to are for him at command. He is brute, and more than brute. He is devil and callous, and the heart of him is not. He can, within his range, direct the elements, the storm, the fog, the thunder. He can command all the meaner things, the rat, the owl, the bat, the moth, the fox, and the wolf. He can grow and become small, and he can at times vanish and come unknown. How then are we to begin our strike to destroy him? How shall we find his where, and having found it, how can we destroy? My friends, this is much. It is a terrible task that we undertake, and there may be consequence to make the brave shudder. For if we fail in this our fight, he must surely win, and then where end we? Life is nothing, I heed him not, but to fail here is not mere life or death. It is that we become as him, that we henceforward become foul things of the night like him, without heart or conscience, preying on the bodies and the souls of those we love best. To us forever are the gates of heaven shut, for who shall open them to us again? We go on for all time, abhorred by all, a blot on the face of God's sunshine, an arrow in the side of him who died for man. But we are face to face with duty, and in such case must we shrink? For me, I say no, but then I am old, and life with his sunshine, his fair places, his song of birds, his music and his love lie far behind. You others are young. Some have seen sorrow, but there are fair days yet in store. What say you?" Whilst he was speaking, Jonathan had taken my hand. I feared, oh so much, that the appalling nature of our danger was overcoming him, when I saw his hand stretch out. But it was life to me to feel its touch, so strong, so self-reliant, so resolute. A brave man's hand can speak for itself. It does not even need a woman's love to hear its music. When the professor had done speaking, my husband looked in my eyes, and I in his. There was no need for speaking between us. "I answer for Mina and myself," he said. "Count me in, Professor." said Mr. Quincey Morris, laconically as usual. I am with you, said Lord Godalming, for Lucy's sake, if for no other reason. Dr. Seward simply nodded. The Professor stood up, and after laying his golden crucifix on the table, held out his hand on either side. I took his right hand, and Lord Godalming his left. Jonathan held my right with his left, and stretched across to Mr. Morris. So, as we all took hands, our solemn compact was made. I felt my heart icy cold, but it did not even occur to me to draw back. We resumed our places, and Dr. Van Helsing went on with a sort of cheerfulness which showed that the serious work had begun. It was to be taken as gravely and in as business-like a way as any other transaction of life. Well, you know what we have to contend against, but we too are not without strength. We have on our side power of combination, a power denied to the vampire kind. We have sources of science. We are free to act and think, and the hours of the day and the night are ours equally. In fact, so far as our powers extend, they are unfettered, and we are free to use them. We have self-devotion in a cause and an end to achieve which is not a selfish one. These things are much. Now, let us see how far the general powers arrayed against us are restrict, and how the individual cannot. In fine, let us consider the limitations of the vampire in general, and of this one in particular. All we have to go upon are traditions and superstitions. These do not at the first appear much when the matter is one of life and death, nay, of more than either life or death. Yet must we be satisfied, in the first place because we have to be, no other means is at our control, and secondly, because after all these things, tradition and superstition are everything. Does not the belief in vampires rest for others, though not, alas, for us, on them? A year ago, which of us would have received such a possibility, in the midst of our scientific, sceptical, matter-of-fact 19th century? We even scouted a belief that we saw justified under our very eyes. Take it, then, that the vampire, and the belief in his limitations and his cure, rest for the moment on the same base. For, let me tell you, he is known everywhere that man have been. In old Greece, in old Rome, he flourish in Germany all over, in France, in India, even in the Sherma seas, and in China, so far from us in all ways. There even is he, and the peoples for him at this day. He have followed the wake of the berserker Icelander, the devil-begotten Hun, the Slav, the Saxon, the Magyar. So far, then, we have all we may act upon, and let me tell you that very much of the beliefs are justified by what we have seen in our own so unhappy experience. The vampire live on and cannot die by mere passing of the time. He can flourish when that he can fatten on the blood of the living. Even more, we have seen amongst us that he can grow even younger, that his vital faculties grow strenuous, and seem as though they refresh themselves when his special pabulum is plenty. But he cannot flourish without this diet. He eat not as others. Even friend Jonathan, who lived with him for weeks, did not ever see him eat, never. He throws no shadow. He make in the mirror no reflect, as again Jonathan observe. He has the strength of many of his hand. Witness again Jonathan when he shut the door against the wolves, and when he help him from the diligence too. He can transform himself to wolf, as we gather from the ship arrival in Whitby, when he tear open the dog. He can be as bat, as Madam Mina saw him on the window at Whitby, and as friend John saw him fly from this so near house, and as my friend Quincey saw him at the window of Miss Lucy. He can come in mist which he create. That noble ship's captain proved him of this. But, from what we know, the distance he can make this mist is limited, and it can only be round himself. He come on moonlight rays as elemental dust, as again Jonathan saw those sisters in the castle of Dracula. He become so small we ourselves saw Miss Lucy, ere she was at peace, slip through a hair's breadth space at the tomb's door. He can, when once he find his way, come out from anything or into anything, no matter how close it be bound or even fused up with fire, solder, you call it. He can see in the dark. No small power this, in a world which is one half shut from the light. Ah, but hear me through. He can do all these things, yet he is not free. Nay, he is even more prisoner than the slave of the galley, than the madman in his cell. He cannot go where he lists. He who is not of nature has yet to obey some of nature's laws. Why, we know not. He may not enter anywhere at the first, unless there be some one of the household who bid him to come, though afterwards he can come as he please. His power ceases, as does that of all evil things, at the coming of the day. Only at certain times can he have limited freedom. If he be not at the place whither he is bound, he can only change himself at noon or at exact sunrise or sunset. These things we are told, and in this record of ours we have proof by inference. Thus, whereas he can do as he will within his limit, when he have his earth home, his coffin home, his hell home, the place unhallowed, as we saw when he went to the grave of the suicide at Whitby, still at other time he can only change when the time come. It is said, too, that he can only pass running water at the slack or the flood of the tide. Then there are things which so afflict him that he has no power, as the garlic that we know of. And as for things sacred, as this symbol, my crucifix, that was amongst us even now when we resolve. To them he is nothing, but in their presence he take his place far off and silent with respect. There are others too which I shall tell you of, lest in our seeking we may need them. The branch of wild rose on his coffin keep him that he move not from it. A sacred bullet fired into the coffin kill him, so that he may be true dead. And as for the stake through him, we know already of its peace, or the cut-off head that giveth rest. We have seen it with our eyes. Thus, when we find the habitation of this man that was, we can confine him to his coffin and destroy him, if we obey what we know. But he is clever. I have asked my friend Arminius of Budapest University to make his record, and from all the means that are, he tell me of what he has been. He must, indeed, have been that voivoda Dracula who won his name against the Turk, over the great river on the very frontier of Turkeyland. If it be so, then he was no common man. For in that time, and for centuries after, he was spoken of as the cleverest and the most cunning, as well as the bravest of the sons of the land beyond the forest. That mighty brain and that iron resolution went with him to his grave, and are even now arrayed against us. The Draculas were, says Arminius, a great and noble race, though now and again were scions who were held by their coevals to have dealings with the evil one. They learned his secrets in the Scholomance, amongst the mountains over Lake Hermannstadt, where the devil claims the 10th scholar is his due. In the records there are words such as Stregoica, witch, Ordog, and Pokel, Satan, and hell, and in one manuscript this very Dracula is spoken of as Wampir, which we all understand too well. There have been from the loins of this very one great man, and good women, and their graves make sacred the earth where alone this foulness can dwell. For it is not the least of its terrors that this evil thing is rooted deep in all good. In soil barren of holy memories it cannot rest. Whilst they were talking, Mr. Morris was looking steadily at the window, and he now got up quietly and went out of the room. There was a little pause, and then the Professor went on. And now we must settle what we do. We have here much data, and we must proceed to lay out our campaign. We know from the inquiry of Jonathan that from the castle to Whitby came 50 boxes of earth, all of which were delivered at Carfax. We also know that at least some of these boxes have been removed. It seems to me that our first step should be to ascertain whether all the rest remain in the house beyond that wall where we look today, or whether any more have been removed. If the latter, we must trace— Here we were interrupted in a very startling way. Outside the house came the sound of a pistol shot. The glass of the window was shattered with a bullet, which, ricocheting from the top of the embrasure, struck the far wall of the room. I am afraid I am at heart a coward, for I shrieked out. The men all jumped to their feet. Lord Godalming flew over to the window and threw up the sash. As he did so, we heard Mr. Morris's voice without. "Sorry, I fear I have alarmed you. I shall come in and tell you about it." A minute later he came in and said, "It was an idiotic thing of me to do, and I ask your pardon, Mrs. Harker, most sincerely. I fear I must have frightened you terribly. But the fact is that whilst the Professor was talking, there came a big bat and sat on the window-sill. I've got such a horror of the damned brutes from recent events that I cannot stand them, and I went out to have a shot, as I have been doing late of evenings whenever I have seen one. You used to laugh at me for it then, Art." "Did you hit it?" asked Dr. Van Helsing. "I don't know. I fancy not, for it flew away into the wood." Without saying any more, he took his seat, and the Professor began to resume his statement. "We must trace each of these boxes, and when we are ready, we must either capture or kill this monster in his lair. Or we must, so to speak, sterilize the earth, so that no more he can seek safety in it. Thus, in the end, we may find him in his form of man between the hours of noon and sunset, and so engage with him when he is at his most weak. And now for you, Madam Mina. This night is the end until all be well. You are too precious to us to have such a risk. When we part tonight, you no more must question. We shall tell you all in good time. We are men, and are able to bear, but you must be our star and our hope, and we shall act all the more free that you are not in the danger, such as we are." All the men, even Jonathan, seemed relieved, but it did not seem to me good that they should brave danger, and perhaps lessen their safety, strength being the best safety, through care of me. But their minds were made up, and though it were a bitter pill for me to swallow, I could say nothing, save to accept their chivalrous care of me. Mr. Morris resumed the discussion. "As there is no time to lose, I vote we have a look at his house right now. Time is everything with him, and swift action on our part may save another victim." I own that my heart began to fail me when the time for action came so close, but I did not say anything, for I had a greater fear that if I appeared as a drag or a hindrance to their work, they might even leave me out of their counsels altogether. They have now gone off to Carfax, with means to get into the house. Man-like, they had told me to go to bed and sleep, as if a woman can sleep when those she loves are in danger. I shall lie down and pretend to sleep, lest Jonathan have added anxiety about me when he returns.
Dr. Seward's Diary, 1 October, 4 a.m. Just as we were about to leave the house, an urgent message was brought to me from Renfield to know if I would see him at once, as he had something of the utmost importance to say to me. I told the messenger to say that I would attend to his wishes in the morning. I was busy just at the moment. The attendant added, "He seems very importunate, sir. I have never seen him so eager. I don't know but what, if you don't see him soon, he will have one of his violent fits." I knew the man would not have said this without some cause, so I said, "All right, I'll go now," and I asked the others to wait a few minutes for me, as I had to go and see my patient. "Take me with you, friend John," said the professor. "His case in your diary interests me much, and it had bearing, too, now and again on our case. I should much like to see him, and especially when his mind is disturbed." "May I come also?" asked Lord Godalming. "Me too," said Quincey Morris. "May I come?" asked Harker. I nodded, and we all went down the passage together. We found him in a state of considerable excitement, but far more rational in his speech and manner than I had ever seen him. There was an unusual understanding of him, which was unlike anything I had ever met with in a lunatic, and he took it for granted that his reason would prevail with others entirely sane. We all five went into the room, but none of the others at first said anything. His request was that I would at once release him from the asylum and send him home. This he backed up with arguments regarding his complete recovery and adduced his own existing sanity. "I appeal to your friends," he said. "They will, perhaps, not mind sitting in judgment on my case. By the way, you have not introduced me." I was so much astonished that the oddness of introducing a madman in an asylum did not strike me at the moment, and besides, there was a certain dignity in the man's manner, so much of the habit of equality, that I at once made the introduction. Lord Godalming, Professor Van Helsing, Mr. Quincey Morris of Texas, Mr. Jonathan Harker, Mr. Renfield. He shook hands with each of them, saying in turn, "Lord Godalming, I had the honor of seconding your father at the Wyndham. I grieve to know by your holding the title that he is no more. He was a man loved and honored by all who knew him, and in his youth was, I have heard, the inventor of a burnt rum punch much patronized on Derby night. Mr. Morris, you should be proud of your great state. Its reception into the Union was a precedent which may have far-reaching effects hereafter, when the pole and the tropics may hold alliance to the stars and stripes. The power of treaty may yet prove a vast engine of enlargement when the Monroe Doctrine takes its true place as a political fable. What shall any man say of his pleasure at meeting Van Helsing? Sir, I make no apology for dropping all forms of conventional prefix. When an individual has revolutionized therapeutics by his discovery of the continuous evolution of brain matter, conventional forms are unfitting, since they would seem to limit him to one of a class. You gentlemen, who by nationality, by heredity, or by the possession of natural gifts, are fitted to hold your respective places in the moving world, I take to witness that I am as sane as at least the majority of men who are in full possession of their liberties. And I am sure that you, Dr. Seward, humanitarian and medico-jurist as well as scientist, will deem it a moral duty to deal with me as one to be considered as under exceptional circumstances. He made his last appeal with a courtly air of conviction which was not without its own charm. I think we were all staggered. For my own part, I was under the conviction, despite my knowledge of the man's character and history, that his reason had been restored, and I felt under a strong impulse to tell him that I was satisfied as to his sanity and would see about the necessary formalities as for his release in the morning. I thought it better to wait, however, before making so grave a statement, for of old I knew the sudden changes to which this particular patient was liable. So I contented myself with making a general statement that he appeared to be improving very rapidly, that I would have a long chat with him in the morning, and would then see what I could do in the direction of meeting his wishes. This did not at all satisfy him, for he said quickly, "But I fear, Dr. Seward, that you hardly apprehend my wish. I desire to go, at once, here, now, this very hour, this very moment, if I may. Time presses, and in our implied agreement with the old scytheman, it is of the essence of the contract. I am sure it is only necessary to put before so admirable a practitioner as Dr. Seward so simple, yet so monumentous a wish, to ensure its fulfillment." He looked at me keenly, and seeing the negative in my face, turned to the others and scrutinized them closely. Not meeting any sufficient response, he went on, "Is it possible that I have erred in my supposition?" "You have," I said frankly, but at the same time, as I felt, brutally. There was a considerable pause, and then he said slowly, "Then I suppose I must only shift my ground of request. Let me ask for this concession, boon, privilege, what you will. I am content to implore in such a case, not on personal grounds, but for the sake of others. I am not at liberty to give you the whole of my reasons, but you may, I assure you, take it from me that they are good ones, sound and unselfish, and spring from the highest sense of duty. Could you look, sir, into my heart, you would approve to the full the sentiments which animate me. Nay, more, you would count me amongst the best and truest of your friends." Again he looked at us all keenly. I had a growing conviction that this sudden change of his entire intellectual method was but yet another phase of his madness, and so determined to let him go on a little longer, knowing from experience that he would, like all lunatics, give himself away in the end. Van Helsing was gazing at him with a look of utmost intensity, his bushy eyebrows almost meeting with the fixed concentration of his look. He said to Renfield in a tone which did not surprise me at the time, but only when I thought of it afterwards, for it was as of one addressing an equal, "Can you not tell frankly your real reason for wishing to be free tonight? I will undertake that if you will satisfy even me, a stranger, without prejudice, and with the habit of keeping an open mind, Dr. Seward will give you at his own risk and on his own responsibility the privilege you seek." He shook his head sadly and with a look of poignant regret on his face. The professor then went on, "Come, sir, bethink yourself. You claim the privilege of reason in the highest degree, since you seek to impress us with your complete reasonableness. You do this, whose sanity we have reason to doubt, since you are not yet released from medical treatment for this very defect. If you will not help us in our effort to choose the wisest course, how can we perform the duty which you yourself put upon us? Be wise and help us, and if we can, we shall aid you to achieve your wish." He still shook his head as he said, "Dr. Van Helsing, I have nothing to say. Your argument is complete, and if I were free to speak, I should not hesitate a moment. But I am not my own master in the matter. I can only ask you to trust me. If I am refused, the responsibility does not rest with me." I thought it was now time to end the scene, which was becoming too comically grave, so I went towards the door, simply saying, Come, my friends, we have work to do. Good night. As, however, I got near the door, a new change came over the patient. He moved towards me so quickly that for the moment I feared that he was about to make another homicidal attack. My fears, however, were groundless, for he held up his 2 hands imploringly and made his petition in a moving manner. As he saw that the very excess of his emotion was militating against him by restoring us more to our old relations, he became still more demonstrative. I glanced at Van Helsing and saw my conviction reflected in his eyes, so I became a little more fixed in my manner, if not more stern, and motioned to him that his efforts were unavailing. I had previously seen something of the same constantly growing excitement in him when he had to make some request of which at the time he had thought much, such for instance as when he wanted a cat, and I was prepared to see the collapse into the same sullen acquiescence on this occasion. My expectation was not realized, for when he found that his appeal would not be successful, he got into quite a frantic condition. He threw himself on his knees and held up his hands, wringing them in plaintive supplication, and poured forth a torrent of entreaty, with tears rolling down his cheeks, and his whole face and form expressive of the deepest emotion. "Let me entreat you, Dr. Seward. Oh, let me implore you to let me out of this house at once. Send me away how you will and where you will. Send keepers with me, with whips and chains. Let them take me in a strait waistcoat manacled and leg ironed, even to jail. But let me go out of this. You don't know what you do by keeping me here. I am speaking from the depths of my heart, of my very soul. You don't know whom you wrong, or how, and I may not tell. Woe is me, I may not tell. By all you hold sacred, by all you hold dear, by your love that is lost, by your hope that lives, for the sake of the Almighty, take me out of this and save my soul from guilt. Can't you hear me, man? Can't you understand? Will you never learn? Don't you know that I am sane and earnest now, that I am no lunatic in a mad fit, but a sane man fighting for his soul? Oh, hear me, let me go, let me go, let me go. I thought that the longer this went on, the wilder he would get, and so would bring on a fit, so I took him by the hand and raised him up. Come, I said sternly, no more of this. We have had quite enough already. Get to your bed and try to behave more discreetly. He suddenly stopped and looked at me intently for several moments. Then, without a word, he rose and, moving over, sat down on the side of the bed. The collapse had come, as on former occasions, just as I had expected. When I was leaving the room, last of our party, he said to me in a quite well-bred voice, "You will, I trust, Dr. Seward, do me the justice to bear in mind later on that I did what I could to convince you tonight."
Okay, well, that's creepy, right? I did what I could to convince you tonight. Now, we've already seen this team of vampire hunters make what I think will prove to be the largest mistake that they could possibly have made. Did you hear it? Did you hear it go by? Remember, in the beginning of today's episode chapters, we heard Seward and Mina agree to tell everybody everything. Mina was very clear. We are stronger together. The least of us must know everything. And Seward, while standing with her, agreed. And as soon as Van Helsing was there, we must protect Madame Mina. Seward caves like a house of cards, nods his head with passion, and that's the end of Mina as part of the crew. And Mina, for her own part, doesn't say anything either. She says, well, the men are messing it up, but what else could I do except nod my head in approval? Maybe Bram Stoker and Wilkie Collins had got together and started a closet feminists group and just wanted to prove to the world that it's really not such a good idea to treat women like this. Now, that being said, there is another thing to discuss, which is Quincy Morris shooting the bat. Surely, at this point in the narrative, you say to yourself, Self, Really? Seriously? They didn't get that the bat was Dracula? And at this point in the narrative, no, it appears that they didn't. Perhaps bats were very, very common then, and it really wasn't that big a deal to have one flapping at your window. I don't know. I thought it was odd, too. And the last bit that may be bugging you, and so I want to address it, is the delivery of all of the earth to Carfax Abbey, and of Seward to go, wow, golly, it's just incredible that Dracula could have chosen here to be the location for his operation. And it seems a little too golly gee whiz. Well, if you're feeling that way at this point in the book, you're not alone. Many people do. But also remember, we still don't have a complete picture on the rules for how Dracula is controlling people and controlling situations. And the closer we get to the end of the book, the more we'll realize that, yeah, we actually are moving into a really interesting period of unreliable narrators, because we know Dracula is doing something with Renfield. So who else is he manipulating? And on that happy note, I wish you a Happy New Year, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye. Please remember to support the people who support CraftLit. Visit Knit Circus online magazine, offering 3 rings of knitting, sewing, and fun. You can check out the latest issue at www.knitcircus.com. And What Would Madame Defarge Knit? A new book of knit and crochet patterns coming to you from the CraftLit family. And please visit the blogs and sites of CraftLit supporters. Those links can be found in the sidebar of the show notes. The show notes can be found at craftlit.com. CraftLit can also be accessed by its own Android and iPhone application. You can purchase it at the iPhone or iTouch application store, or you can subscribe free at iTunes. CraftLit is made possible by the generous support of its listeners, and for that, I am truly grateful. And remember, if your hands are too busy to pick up a book, at least you can turn one.